Hello, I'm Heather Miles from the University of Manchester. Thank you for having me virtually at the NACIS conference in Oklahoma. I'm talking to you today from Shropshire in the UK, but I wish I was there with you. I'm a first year geography PhD student exploring contrasting mapping approaches for geographic research methodology. While many of the previous session speakers have spoken about making mapping more accessible to members of the public, my research is about the wider use of mapping within academic geography. This is particularly pertinent to transdisciplinary research. I'm going to be talking today about how different mapping practices generate contrasting types of data and understanding, and how these can be used in transdisciplinary research, for example, across human and physical geography. And I'll be illustrating this with a hypothetical vignette a little later on. So some background context. One theme that comes up again and again in the cartographic literature is the value of the process itself of making and using maps. This has been highlighted by amateur map makers creating maps of their own communities who value the stories told during the activity. Also, GI scientists creating geovisualizations using GIS, for whom experimentation in how they present data is informative in itself, as well as professional cartographers who write about their creation of maps. Is map making and deployment really a continuum of practice focused to differing degrees on the final map or the mapping process? Another theme in the critical cartographic literature is that many geographers are not doing mapping, which is perhaps surprising given that those outside geography and cartography might imagine that the two are very closely related. For example, this chart demonstrates the decline in maps appearing in the Annals of the Association of American Geographers. The story is the same for the transactions of the Institute of British Geographers. Dodge and Perkins, writing in 2008, describe a decline from 2.5 maps per article in 1989 to 0.6 in 2006. That is not to say that geographers don't talk about maps. Rather, it is that there are critical geographers that discuss maps, and then there are GI scientists that make and use maps, as has been much discussed across the critical GIS and cartographic literature. However, mapping can generate a range of data and knowledge of interest to geographers. Laura Lopresti's 2018 paper, Maps in Out of Place, highlights how cartographic processes generate the types of knowledge that geographers may be interested in. She gives examples of map exercises that lend themselves to understanding contrasting conceptions of space, which may not be Euclidean. And Jim Thatcher, of course, has discussed this with O'Sullivan and Bergman. In one of Lopresti's example exercises, different perceptions of space are explored by comparing a community-made map and satellite imagery using GIS georeferencing and warping tools. In addition, Lopresti's colleague Tanya Rossetto has explored a distinctive form of knowledge, embodied knowledge, generated during mapping exercises. This is in both the tactile and kinesthetic sense. This relates to tactility and kinesthesia, both in the field and at the surface of the map. All maps are tactile surfaces, she argues. This embodied or corporeal aspect of knowledge was reflected in my own ethnographic work with Molly O'Halloran and Daniel Hoffman. For example, Molly spoke about the muscle experience of drawing and painting a meandering river. This led to the question, are there in fact several versions or practices of mapping that all generate different types of geographic knowledge? Rather than thinking about mapping in terms of who's doing it or the purpose or the technology used, how might mapping be conceptualized according to the type of data or knowledge that is generated? So just to go through these quickly before describing them in some more detail in my example vignette a little later on, we have fixed format variables, likely numeric, of the sort you might find with topographic or thematic mapping, or alternatively a raster file such as remote sensing data. We have words as data or knowledge sensed or recorded. Often community mappers deploy someone as a note taker to record discussions that take place as a community map is created. We have creative pieces and artwork. For example, sketch mapping or photo mapping may be the medium through which understandings of space are generated. Multisensory, this encompasses the tactile and kinesthetic aspects of the haptic, as well as sound, smell, taste and sight, feeling, emotion. The aim of some mapping exercises is to generate understanding about feelings in places. These are not mutually exclusive practices, and as just described a bit with the last example, they transcend any binaries concerned with what has been termed representation and non-representation, i.e. mapping practices are all a mixture of inscription and performance, but with differing emphases on each. For example, as critical and feminist GIS scientists such as Cope and Elwood have demonstrated, GIS is not only a captured mapping, but also a performance in terms of, and I quote them here, ways researchers and research participants make choices about which tools to use, what constitute data, whose voices and perspectives get included or excluded, how displays and other representations are put together, the means of communicating results, and what might be the broader implications and possibilities for new forms of knowledge. Some forms of qualitative GIS are an example of this, as Cope and Elwood have demonstrated. And then on the other side of the diagram, we have common methods of geographic research, measurement using survey or using equipment, archival research, semi and unstructured interviewing, and ethnography. Associated with the forms of data and knowledge in colour here, variables, words, senses, viscerality. So you can see the connection between two sides of the diagram. These lines show both the way that mapping has been deployed most frequently, quantitative GIS, but there are a huge number of other ways that they could be deployed, as represented by the blue lines here. So this black line represents quantitative GIS, but the blue lines represent mapping practices that could be deployed more often for other forms of geographic research approach that utilise different forms of data and understanding. So we have qualitative GIS, as just mentioned. In terms of measurement, we have sound mapping and motion mapping. But then we also have literature mapping, for example, map as elicitation in a semi or unstructured interview, for example, Esri story map, speculative mapping game, how are phenomena classified, that's by participants creating creative or art-based maps, walk-along interview, drift, kinesthetic mapping, mapping as minor practice. A further interesting and useful dimension is that both geographical research and mapping exercises are increasingly concerned with what might be rather than purely what is, i.e. speculative, subversive, experimental, imagined futures. In mapping, this is reflected in serious, playful or experimental mapping and map art, as I just mentioned. Both of these may consider both substantive issues, what might be community, social, environmental effects with particular interventions or scenarios in the local area, for example, or they may consider the nature of knowledge itself and the implications of particular research and scientific styles. This leads on nicely to what I find the most interesting and promising aspect of these multiple forms of mapping. Since different types of data and knowledge are generated by different forms of mapping, can these contrasting practices be deployed together as an approach to transdisciplinarity? This is particularly pertinent to geography with its famous human and physical split. The principle of transdisciplinarity is best understood by its contrast to multidisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity. Multidisciplinarity is the juxtaposition of disciplinary research findings. Interdisciplinarity aims for a synthesis in shared foci. Transdisciplinarity goes beyond both of these. Transdisciplinary research is more than the sum of the disciplines involved, as described by Nicolescu. Research findings are generated by a critical engagement with the differences between disciplinary and onto-epistemological assumptions. There are different proposed routes to transdisciplinarity, some of which centre on rebuilding academic institutional arrangements, but the version of transdisciplinarity that I adopt is influenced by Gilles Deleuze after Maniglier. Arguably, Deleuze's central concern was with how philosophers think and how researchers research. For him, thought and research should be heterogeneous. As Maniglier nicely describes, the fact that we could think differently is precisely what makes us think. Deleuze and his co-author Guattari, along with many other thinkers, have an annoying habit of using the terms map and cartography metaphorically, but occasionally they're a bit more literal, as in this quote. Maps are superimposed in such a way that each map finds itself modified in the following map, rather than finding its origin in the preceding one. From one map to the next, it is not a matter of searching for an origin, but of evaluating displacements. Such displacements in thought, or in this case in mapping practice, are for Deleuze the primary way of understanding life and the world. I think this second quote is a great one too for capturing this differential, heterogeneous and transdisciplinary way of thinking and researching. Establish a logic of the and, overthrow ontology, do away with foundations, nullify endings and beginnings. This way of thinking can be operationalized by deploying the breadth of mapping practices as illustrated in the middle of the last slide, i.e. turning all the blue joining lines to black. So how does a multi-method approach to mapping do this, practically speaking? So I'm going to talk through a very simplified hypothetical vignette of a research project investigating the potential for reforesting parts of a popular lake and protected area in order to increase biodiversity. So I thought I would use a worked example here with you to demonstrate more clearly how mapping practices can differ in context and how these differences can be employed to make an impact on geographical research processes. The whole area in this vignette, including the park, is very popular with tourists who enjoy the wild landscapes, mostly lakes, mountains, heathland and sheep farming. However, prior to the sheep farming of the last few centuries, this area had much more woodland and as a result, much greater biodiversity. The research seeks to explore both the benefits and challenges of reforesting on this particular site. The researchers need to explore the different values associated with the park, how do people use and experience different landscapes. The park includes restored historic manor farm buildings, and most of the visitor information is focused on the estate's history of Herdwick sheep farming. The project involves a range of researchers, including physical biogeographers specialising in woodland ecosystems and human geographers specialising in tourism and also landscape values. The woodland ecosystem specialists create a land use, land cover and biodiversity map using remote sensing data, GIS and an ecological survey on foot for the whole area, both currently forested and unforested. This shows that species diversity is much greater in the forested areas of the park. The benefit in terms of biodiversity, if the area is reforested, is huge. Tourism researchers conduct a visitor survey about which areas of the park are visited. They create a map illustrating this. This shows that few visitors go to the wooded part. The park's managers are concerned that visitor numbers will fall with reforestation. The landscape researchers aim to learn more of visitors' experiences of the park using creative, multisensory and speculative mapping methods. There are several parent and child groups that regularly visit at the park. In a creative exercise with them, the children and the parents are invited to draw sketch maps of the park. There is a large play area and the maps show the children's play apparatus in remarkable detail, which prompts the researchers to ask about it. The parents joke that they come to the park mostly for the play area. The group is then invited to use a specially designed mapping app in which different imaginative and speculative mapping games can be played. In one activity, the participants are led by the app on a woodland treasure hunt, counting tree species by photographing leaves. The app also shows participants the other tree species that would once have grown here prior to the sheep grazing in the park. They are also encouraged to draw a sketch map of what the park may look like in the future, photograph their map, and share for other participants to see on the app. Many of the children draw maps that are full of different animals, birds and insects, and there are many comments from the adult participants about the value of a biodiverse world. The biogeographers, tourism and landscape researchers accompany the participants on this walk. Many of the families say that they never come into the woodland. There is much talk of how rough and uneven the paths are, and they are not well signposted. The researchers notice that this means that it is particularly hard going for those with little ones. Two of the mothers say that they would not come into the woods on their own with the children. It would certainly feel a bit lonely on their own, given that so few people tend to come into the wood. Partway through the project, there is an open day at which all the researchers and participants come together and share and discuss the different mapping exercises. The different maps are displayed, and each group of researchers and participants talk through how they were created and what they show. Two of the researchers take notes of the discussions. For example, the biogeographers explain the different sources of ecological data and how they are used in a GIS technique to create the biodiversity map. Tourism researchers discuss a map of park use, and the landscape researchers trace their woodland walk. As they trace their journey, they remember how the walk felt, and they can almost smell the wood. It is agreed that this multi-method mapping has demonstrated the ways in which people's value for and experiences of woodlands, biodiversity and landscape are complex. For the next step of the project, the researchers decide to carry out a grey literature review of existing reforestation programmes elsewhere in order to explore visitor experiences of different reforestation types, with contrasting approaches to visitor path making, setup, information, activities. The biogeographers and landscape researchers decide to create some interactive geovisualizations illustrating different biodiversity scenarios based on these different types of reforestation projects. Of course, this is a much oversimplified example, and there are also very complex economic challenges. It is probable that some of the families visiting the park are themselves part of sheep farming agriculture, which I didn't include in this example. Forms of biodiversity on agricultural land could also be explored using similar speculative and experimental mapping activities. So that's all for this very, very simple little vignette of a hypothetical project deploying multi-method mapping. This research reflected a complex socio-environmental challenge. Biodiversity can be effectively achieved through reforestation, but without further consideration of how to implement this, visitor numbers and therefore tourist revenue could fall. The different mapping exercises demonstrate very different approaches to making sense of the world, and relatedly different sets of values as regards biodiversity, as well as the use and experience of landscapes by one particular demographic group, in this case, parents and children. The differences in disciplinary assumptions or between values cannot ever be resolved, but they led in this example to an avenue for the rest of the research in the second phase of the project. This phase explored different reforestation programme types, both in terms of biodiversity and visitor values and experience. The approach reflects transdisciplinarity because the differences in approaches are productive of new understandings. The contrasting mapping methods enabled a more meaningful understanding of the challenge. I suggest that Deleuze's concept of difference, or perhaps better termed heterogeneous thinking, usefully demonstrates the productivity of multi-method mapping. Understandings are not fixed, i.e. something new is added each time with different mappings. As Cope and Elwood described, this fosters debate and iterative interpretation. Many other mapping exercises could have been carried out. These can be deployed together in a lot of different combinations according to the research context. This is why I called this presentation 101 Practices of Mapping. Thank you very much for listening. I would really welcome any comments or questions. Thank you.